Reviewing games is complicated. For someone who likes to talk and write about games, I tend to only watch reviews and think pieces after I've already played a game. There are the rare occasions where a video will convince me to play something I've never thought about before, but more often than not, I'd rather go into a game completely blind. This is especially true for horror games. A lot of the time, the surprise comes from not knowing what comes next, and nothing takes the sting out of a scare like knowing exactly when the ghost goes boo. Sometimes, however, I play a game that I really want to talk about. Games that I think really shake things up, offer something unique to the scene, but the very act of talking about them spoils what I found so special about them in the first place. Today, I'm going to try my best to talk to you about Lost in Vivo, and tell you in as few words as possible why it's one of the best horror games of the last few years. Here's how this video is going to work. I'm going to attempt to convince you to play this game. I'll progressively tell you more and more about it, and while I won't be full on spoiling anything here, if anything I say sparks your interest, I recommend stopping and going in as blind as you can. My hope is that if I manage to convince you early on to play the game, then you can dip out of the video and go play it. That may seem like a poor idea from a view's perspective, but I would honestly prefer you to experience it as fresh as possible. Consider this your first recommendation. If you trust the words of a random stranger who likes to talk about horror games on the internet, then you should go play Lost in Vivo. It's only a tenner, and if you like claustrophobic first-person horror with some incredible creature designs and some Silent Hill inspiration, then you'll adore it. I promise you, it's worth it. If you need a little more than that to go on, let's talk a bit about the game itself. Lost in Vivo is the brainchild of Akuma Kira. If you pay attention to the indie game horror community, then you might just recognize that name as one of the key minds behind, and voices of, Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion. Kira has been around the horror scene for a while, and it's no surprise that they have a pretty good grasp on how to make a good scare. The game begins with our protagonist walking their dog Danny down the road, when a freak storm suddenly hits and drags your puppy down into the sewers. Wasting no time, you find yourself down a ladder and into the sewage system below. The gameplay is entirely first person, and the environments are incredibly tight. Claustrophobia is the name of the game. The sewer pipes are extremely cramped, and as you find your way into different areas, very few of them give you room to breathe. Danny's trip down the drain isn't just a contrived reason to drag you into a horror scenario either. She very much plays a key role in the gameplay. The sewers feature a lot of dead ends and split pathways, but by pressing spacebar, you can make the protagonist whistle, which causes a response in the form of a bark. You know how tons of horror games tell you to wear headphones? Well, in this one, it's very important that you do. The 3D sound helps you to follow the barks and tells you which way you should be going. This is the primary mechanic of the game. It plays an important role, but it's not all you'll be doing. Along the way to find Danny, you might start seeing more shadows creeping around corners, or scuttling from behind grates. The dark recesses of the sewage system are hiding all sorts of horrors, so when you find a hammer, or even a pistol, it's important you hold on to it tight. Vivo is a survival horror game at heart. You collect ammo and have to manage your resources to make sure you don't find yourself running out at the wrong time. But it's not an overly punishing game. You always have the opportunity to use your melee weapons, and since your health regenerates, you don't need to worry about getting stuck with no healing items. Once you get your weapons, you really start to see where the game's influences lie. Vivo has very obvious DNA from 90s survival horror masters like Silent Hill and Resident Evil, and while you'd be hard-pressed to find a horror series that doesn't take some inspiration from these two behemoths, I've yet to see a game so perfectly encapsulate what makes survival horror great. In my experience, there are a few different types of games that are inspired by Silent Hill, and they vary quite drastically in quality. The first is reserved for games that think Silent Hill begins and ends with fog, the kind where you look at screenshots and go, yeah, I can see the inspiration, but then you watch gameplay and it couldn't be any further from the source material. The second is the hugely common, we just wanted to make PT again. PT is up there as one of the most influential games to never be released, and there's no surprise that it inspires horror devs. The issue is when you just take the concept of PT and put it in your game without doing anything to make it unique, you just come off as a plagiarist. The final camp, which Lost in Vivo completely belongs in, is reserved for games that completely understand what made Silent Hill and games of its ilk so good. It's not just the aesthetic or gameplay, it's a combination of everything. Silent Hill is is freaky monster designs and eerie sound effects, just as much as it is janky voice acting and emotional storytelling. There are parts of this game's sound design that could have come directly from Akira Yamaoka's files, and some of the locations would feel right at home in a Team Silent game. Let's get a little bit further into the nitty-gritty of the game. Lost in Vivo is split into multiple sections. Each one brings you to a different part of the underground. While the sewers remain an important element, you may find yourself in a derelict train station, abandoned mine shafts, or a surprisingly pristine research facility. Each of these segments come with their own gameplay changes, enemies, and story. While the plot is set up to be about rescuing Danny, that's not really all that's going on here. The actual story, which is mentioned on the Steam page and in the opening cutscene, is about exposure therapy. In Vivo, exposure therapy specifically refers to facing your fears and phobias directly, and what better way to cure claustrophobia than to crawl through tunnels chased by giant cockroaches. In each area, the protagonist finds notes left by a number of different characters. The train station, for example, is haunted by a ghost who committed suicide on the tracks, and you find out more about her as you explore. On top of this, you've got the lost tapes, which you can find scattered throughout the game, that tell their own story completely disconnected from the main game. Probably the best section of the game occurs in the Nezumi lab, an outlier among the game's areas, and a pretty clear nod to Resident Evil. The monsters here are failed experiments. You read notes between two doctors, one of which has seemingly gone mad, feeding his monstrous creations rats and talking about sacrifices. Up until this point, the game has had some fantastic moments, but nothing prepares you for what happens next. From the lab onwards, the game continues to ramp up towards some horrifying moments that I 100% won't be spoiling in this video. What makes Lost in Vivo so special are the surprises. Once you think you've figured out what the game is going for, it hits a corner and suddenly starts barreling in another direction. The main game is quite short. Your first run will probably take somewhere between 3 and 4 hours, but there is so much more in here. Between the multiple endings, the lost tapes, and the secrets, you can easily spend a lot longer uncovering every aspect of it. There's an entirely unrelated action game hidden away in the game's secrets. It reminds me a lot of the PS1 and PS2 era, when Easter eggs were a lot more common than they are now. You know what? I think I've said enough. Lost in Vivo is a game that defies description. I could sit here and tell you that the gameplay is fun, or the enemy designs are creepy, and while that's all true, it's the stuff I can't talk about that makes it so unique. A lot of horror games can feel like paint by numbers, filling out a checklist of scary moments, but every so often, you find something like Lost in Vivo so in a class of its own that you can't say anything other than just play it. If you're a fan of old school survival horror games, I think you owe it to yourself to play this game. It's both a love letter to the genre and a fantastic game in its own right. Thanks for watching. I considered rolling this game into another itch video, but honestly, I think it deserves a spotlight on itself. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you do play it or have already played it, please let me know what you think in the comments. As always, my coffee and other socials are in the description, and I'll see you again real soon.